We are happy to have you. It's been a gloomy day here. My entire drive up to Fort Wayne, it looked the same, and it was just slowly raining the entire time. So it's pretty warm in here, though. It's already toasty. Over the past 2 years, we've dealt with a lot of different things. We are right on that 2-year mark of when COVID first started appearing, and we have many members who have done a fantastic job, which I'm talking to all of you. We've done a good job of making sure that we're trying to protect and we're trying to be cognizant and be aware of everyone else around us, not only our own health. And so I appreciate all the emphasis that everybody has put into that, but at the same time, we still are dealing with it. It's still very much present. And we've had to go to solely online services at different times over the past 2 years, maybe more than we wanted to, but it's just a reality of what we deal with. Much of our congregation here and much of the congregation in Fort Wayne have either contracted it or they've been vaccinated or dealing with some degrees of it. And so hopefully as we continue through this, we are going to continue to build up immunities. But for the time being, we can't let our guard down. It's still very prevalent in our lives. And as winter approaches, as the cold approaches, as our immune systems weaken, we don't have as much sunlight, we aren't out in fresh air quite as much, this is still something we have to deal with. And as individuals, we try to keep our own health up, but at the same time, we also try to protect one another, right? Our brothers and sisters, we're here for one another, we're accountable to one another, and we need to do our best to do that protection, the best that we can. I know it's very difficult to stay home from services. That is one of the things that we absolutely hate. We avoid it at all costs because we get such a pick-me-up from Sabbath services. This is where we thrive. All week long, we go through our weeks. We deal with coworkers. We deal with strangers in the stores who don't understand the big picture of what we're doing. And just coming through those front doors, the first mark is that sunset on the Sabbath. We can't wait for the sun to set, for that starting of the Sabbath evening, and then getting through these doors to be with God's people, to be with God's children, be with our brothers and sisters. It's uplifting, it's rejuvenating, and it's what gets us from week to week, right? That's what helps us to get from hurdle to hurdle, get through these strenuous times. It's not only something that's commanded, but it's something that we need. We need it for our own health and our own mental states. We need each other. So we share this special holy day. We share this special holy day that God has set aside, and that's what vaults us from one week to the next. It's how we get through our lives. It's how we get through this entire lifespan that we have of this physical thing. And thankfully, we do have technology at our fingertips that help us to counteract not being able to come here in person. And that's not what we want to do, but the reality is sometimes we do have to keep it virtually. And so for my title today, I've titled this, Avert Risk as Winter Approaches. Avert Risk as Winter Approaches. And as we go through this sermon today, I'm going to talk about a couple different things that God goes over in the Bible. Sometimes questions, as human beings, there's been a lot of questions that have arisen over the past 2 years about, okay, have we broken God's commandment? Have we broken his commandment to come together on the Sabbath because we've had to use technology? We've had to go virtual. We weren't able to come in person. And these are real questions that everybody has. And so today's sermon, I want to go over a couple different situations where God has already instituted and put in place an understanding for quarantine, an understanding and a baseline for what it is that's expected of us, and how we're supposed to interact with one another, and how we really plan for dangerous situations and what we're supposed to do to avoid them. God creates these rules. He sets the tone for how we should be when we're sick. But then he also goes a little bit further, which we're going to get into some examples that show us that it's not only about sickness. And God has planned for everything. God has planned for all types of exposures. And he sets the guidelines for what it is that we're supposed to do. And so as we get into the normal flu season, if there's anything normal about flu season anymore, right? Nobody hears normal flu. That's not a word we use anymore. But this normal flu season, where our immune systems are somewhat compromised, we do need to be on special alert. We need to be diligent. We need to be working. And we find a lot in the Bible about quarantine laws, and we can learn a lot from it. I know that we've all been diligently praying. We've been talking to God, asking God that we don't ever have to run into virtual services again. We don't ever have to deal with it again, right? We don't ever go fully virtual again. The reality of the situation is that COVID is still a dominating force in our lives. It's not going anywhere. This is new life. And that's why we're still planning activities. This is why we're trucking along, because this is life. We're not going to stop. We're not going to back off. We will be diligent. We will be cautious. We will pay attention to what's going on. But we are going to do our best to be able to come together and to be able to celebrate and fellowship each other's company. Right now, we're dealing with Omicron. That's the new variant that has popped up. Thankfully, with the research that's been coming out, it looks like it's a little bit milder symptoms than what they're dealing with, what we've been dealing with Delta. So that's thankfully a good sign. The bad thing is it seems like it's twice as transmissive again. So that means more people are going to catch it, but hopefully it's not going to be as detrimental. But the reality is we are dealing with it. So there may be a time that comes where we have to use our technology again. Now, I'm not saying this is the standard. I don't want this to be the pattern. I gave this sermon in Fort Wayne, and 2 weeks later I had to shut down. I was very clear that I don't have any intentions of shutting down again. Reality was that the majority of the congregation got sick up there, and it was the right thing to do, is to protect everyone, to try to mitigate the spread of it. And so that's not what I want to happen here. That's not what I'm planning on happening here. But the reality is that there may be a time where we have to balance the positives and the negatives and the risk, and we may have to end up going to virtual services again. When you look around us at what the world has gone through over these last 2 years, we try to buffer ourselves from it, because what we've seen out in society is that this is human nature in general. We are polarized, right? We take one side, or we take a stance generally, and we stick to that. And that's the only answer, that's the right answer, and everybody else is wrong. And this is what we're dealing with, this perspective that there's no balance. Humans have trouble maintaining this balance, and we see it with politics, we see it with ideologies, everything that humans do, we see this polarization happening, and we get segmented, right? You get thrown into different camps that, you believe this, you have this ideology, to the point where sometimes people won't talk to you anymore. You may have neighbors that are like, I don't want to have anything to do with you. You don't think like I do, so don't come over here. But that's not how we're supposed to be. Satan, this is what Satan thrives on. This is what Satan's been doing. In my pastor's update last night, I sent you those 20 different names. Terminology of who Satan is, his character, his attitude, what he's trying to do. And he thrives in this environment. This is what he lives for, this divisiveness. Because there is very little fruit, if any fruit, that is produced out of this environment. We don't see good things coming from it. And so this is why Satan loves it. This is why he's pushing it. And this is why we don't really get engaged in politics. We don't get engaged in what the government's doing or what they're forcing us to do, as long as they allow us to respect God and follow his laws. This is not our world, and we don't want it to be our world. We know there's a world coming that we do want to be part of, and so we tried to maintain a balance. We try to maintain a level-headedness and understanding God's big picture. And it's extremely difficult, because we still have to live in this world. And so what we need to do is really zero in on truth. We need to zero in on God's word and how we live and how we act and how we treat other people. And we do that by keeping our nose in the Bible, by making sure we understand Scripture and we know Scripture. And that's our balanced approach. That's how we do our job. That's how we manage stress. That's how we get through our days. And when we come together on the Sabbath, this is how we build each other up. Not using division, but using unity. We may not always agree on everything, but we learn to respect each other. And so I want to go through a couple things today. So let's get in, whether it's good times or bad, let's get into God's word and understand exactly what his framework is and what he's doing. So if you want to start out by going over to Leviticus chapter 13 and verse 40. This is one of the basic quarantine laws that we find in the Bible. This is kind of the obvious one. This is somebody who is going to be sick. He is sick, and therefore you should be quarantined. This is Leviticus chapter 13 and verse 40. we're going to see a couple different words used that kind of help us. God doesn't use quarantine, but he uses things that basically mean the same thing. We're going to see that that's our terminology today. But it also, if you're following along with the annual chronological reading of the Bible, you would have gotten through this section over the past couple of weeks, so some of this should seem familiar. So let's pick it up in Leviticus chapter 13, starting in verse 40. It says, "As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he is bald, but he is clean. He whose hair has fallen from his forehead, he is bald on his forehead, but he is clean. And if there is on the bald side of the head or the bald forehead a reddish-white sore, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. Then the priest shall examine it, and indeed, if the swelling of the sore is reddish-white on his bald head or on his bald forehead, as the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, he is a leprous man." So this is really clear. We are talking about a disease. We're talking about somebody who does have leprosy. God mocks him several times for his bald head. I don't know why God does that. That's not nice. We don't do that to people. No, God's just making a point, right? He's saying this guy is sick. This guy has a disease. He has a plague. And so he says in verse 44, he says, "He is a leprous man. He is unclean." And so we need to notice the terminology. He's unclean. So, okay, if you are sick, you're not only miserable at home, wishing you would die at times, you are considered unclean to God. He says you're unclean. The problem is a lot of times what we do, we use these terms interchangeably. We use sick and unclean, and we think that's automatic for both. If you're sick, you're unclean. If you're unclean, you're sick. That's not how God uses it, though. It's not an automatic situation. It's an inaccurate thought, and we're going to go through some situations where God kind of clears this up for us. But let's keep reading right here in verse 44. It says, "The priest shall surely pronounce him unclean, his sore on his head. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare. And he shall cover his mustache and cry, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall be unclean." So not only is he sick, not only is God making fun of his bald head, but he has to actually cover his mouth. He has to cover his mouth, and there's a verbal warning so that everybody else around knows that he is unclean. They need to stay back. They need their distance because they could potentially be infected because of him. So we see this situation of the guy's sick, miserable, probably doesn't feel great, and then he still has to scream out this warning, "Hey, everybody pay attention to me, I'm unclean." So there's a warning. There's a danger to these people. And God makes sure it's clear. This isn't to humiliate him. This isn't to make a mockery of him, but God's saying that there's a danger here. There's a warning sign that needs to be given because there's a risk to everybody else. And then verse 46, it says, "All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." So this is where we start getting into some of God's terminology. He says, he shall dwell outside the camp. That's away from everybody else. He's no longer allowed to be part of society. He has to be removed and dwell alone because there's a risk. There's a risk that he is sick and he will infect everyone else. And so this is where we start to get into our terminology. We use quarantining. That's our big word that we've heard over and over and over again in the last 2 years, quarantining. This is basically the same thing what God's talking about. Dwelling alone outside the camp. We remove ourselves. Many of you may have experienced this in your own homes. When you become sick, everybody else in your home runs in, shuts your door, and says, "You don't come out. If you need something, we'll bring it to you." Why? Because nobody else in the house wants sick, right? You're quarantined to wherever you are whenever you discover that you're sick. Now, at some point, you may have already infected everybody else, and that's part of being a family, right? Especially if your kids go to public school, it seems like they bring home every virus that every kid in the whole school has. That's parenthood, right? Because you end up getting it. And we spread it to one another. But this is why God's talking about quarantining. He's saying, no, take precautions. There's things that we can do to buffer one another. And quarantining removes us from society. It keeps us from going into crowds because we're not supposed to put a threat on the rest of society. He's saying don't risk this to everybody else. If you are sick, you have to quarantine. For us, we know the red flags are fevers, coughing, sneezing. Now, we start to get in some gray areas because many of us have allergies, and we sneeze and we cough for a certain period of time, or if we're around certain smells or things. So, yes, there's not a complete black and white on this. There are these gray areas, but we need to be diligent to mitigate the risk the best that we can as individuals. And remember that the whole point of this sermon is to lean on God's word so that we understand the instructions of what we're supposed to be doing, how we're supposed to act, and not get sucked into all these different ideologies of society, all these different camps and the hate speech that goes on because people don't understand what's going on in the world. And there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of anxiety because of that. We have to be as balanced as we can and maintain the focus. So there's another example that I want to look at, and this isn't about the people that are sick. It's about items. It's about things. Not only does God talk about people who are sick, but he talks about the things, the clothing that they wear. It's actually the verse right after this. It's Leviticus chapter 13, verse 47. It says, also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it is woolen garment or a linen garment, whether it is a warp or a woof of linen or wool, whether in leather or in anything made of leather. So he's talking about the clothing, the items that they would have been having on their body. If any of this is carrying that plague, that disease, then there's a process. There's a process of making sure that that doesn't infect somebody else. And so we're not going to read through the rest of this, but if you read down through 59, it goes through this process of washing and the priest looking and making sure it's not spreading, and then they're washing again. And it ends up, if it's not clean, if they still see this contamination occurring, it has to be destroyed. It's burned up, completely burned up, because these are items that are no longer clean. And God doesn't want to take the risk. He doesn't want to put that risk on other people. He doesn't want to cause any more harm to anybody else. And so they destroy it. And so quarantining wasn't only for people that were sick. It was for items, the things that could potentially cause somebody else harm. You know, we can look at a couple of examples of where more quarantine comes into play. If you flip back just a couple chapters to Leviticus chapter 11. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 24. This is going through unclean meats here. And so these are people who aren't sick. We're going to get into some situations here where we have had a misunderstanding of that unclean equals sick, or sick equals unclean. And this is what I want to get into, and this is what a big part of this focus is going to be today, is making sure that we understand what God is doing, kind of the foundation of what he has set. And if you look at Leviticus chapter 11, verse 24, it says, by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. And we're talking about unclean animals here. So this is talking about a dead pig, a dead snake in your yard. For me, growing up, we had chickens. Occasionally, raccoons would get into our chicken coop. They would kill the chickens, they'd eat the eggs. And we'd find them in there, and they'd still be eating eggs. So we'd have to kill them, and we'd have to take them out. Because if you don't know anything about raccoons, once they get in the chicken coop, they don't ever get out of that chicken coop. If you get them out of the chicken coop, they go back in the chicken coop. So you have to kill them. For us, that would have been an unclean animal that we were dealing with, a carcass of an unclean animal. And so when you touch it and you move it, when you move it to the berry pile or whatever you're doing with it, you become unclean. You're unclean at that point. God never says you're sick. He says you're unclean. And he leaves it at that. And if you look at verse 25, it says, whoever carries part of the carcass of any of these shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. So there's this period of time where if you found yourself in this situation where you had to dispose of some type of carcass, you couldn't even go back home. There was a process that God said you have to go through. He says you have to remove yourself, you have to separate yourself, you have to clean, and then you have to wait until evening, and then you can return home. At that point, you can go back home, you can change your clothes, you can have your dinner, whatever it may be, whatever your normal routine is. But there's this period built in to try to ensure the safety of everybody else because of what they were dealing with. In verse 26, it says, the carcass of any animal which divides the foot, but is not cloven-hooved, or does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. Everyone who touches it shall be unclean. Not if you're sick. It was coming into contact with this unclean carcass. So there was this period of time that God baked in to ensure the protection of everybody else, making sure and ensuring their safety. And for us, this seems like a small amount of time. It may be a couple hours, it may be half a day, whatever it may be at that point. It may seem nonsensical to us, but everything God does is strategic. There's purpose behind it. And with us now having science of understanding the diseases that animals carry, especially unclean animals, we see that there's a risk to that. And some of that stuff pops up pretty quick. And so we see God protecting his people. He's doing everything he can to ensure their safety. And then verse 27, it says, whatever goes on its paws among all kinds of animals that go on all fours, those are unclean to you. Whoever touches any such carcass shall be unclean until evening. Whoever carries any such carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It is unclean to you. So this unclean, this is where our focus is going to be, is understanding this difference between sickness and being deemed unclean. Unclean means that there's a risk to other people. And we deal with this all the time. We are dealing with it a lot right now because of the virus, because of the different things that we deal with in this world. But when we really look at this and we start to understand, it gives us some comfort, doesn't it? Because this shows us that God created science. This shows us the foundation of science. God is the inventor of science. He understood aerobic, he understood anaerobic bacteria, he understood viruses, he understood how it impacts our bodies. And so he plans for that. He helps us. He didn't explain why they couldn't do these things. He didn't explain why they had to be removed. But thankfully, because of the age that we live in, the era that we live in, we understand the backing of it. And so we don't sit here and question, well, that doesn't make sense. Why is he saying just because I touched this dead animal, I can't do this? But for us, it does make sense now. For them, they were just expected to obey. Like all the laws we're supposed to obey. Thankfully, with time, we've become more knowledgeable and we understand that there's science that backs this up. There's science that backs it up. So God has planned for this. God has planned for these situations that we find ourselves in, and there's a responsibility that we have not to endanger one another. And that's what God's whole point is of this. That there's a love and respect that he has for all of his children, and therefore we're expected to extend that same respect. We're supposed to be diligent. We're supposed to mitigate risks the best that we can. And sometimes that means we make the hard decision of we're not that sick, but we need to stay home because there would be a risk to others. There would be a risk to the brothers and sisters that we love so dearly. And so we need to take precautions. And that's hard. That's hard because we as individuals need each other, right? Especially when we're sick, when we're down. Having the comfort of one another is that boost that we need. That's that rejuvenation. But at the same time, God tells us, and he has planned ahead of time and says, this is what you shouldn't do. These are the precautions that you should take. And so when we find ourselves in situations like this, we need to really consider now in our day, okay, am I unclean? And it's not the word we use, but it's the word God uses. Am I unclean? We find another example. If you go back to Numbers chapter 31. Numbers chapter 31 and verse 19. This is pertaining to going to war. And these are men that would have gone to war and were expected to quarantine. And this instance here, this is Moses talking to the Israelites after they battled the Midianites and Moabites. They tried to basically infiltrate Israel and cause them to slip into idolatrous practices, to reject God through their religious practices. They used their women as tools to do this. And so they were sneaky about it and tried to do this and undermine God's people. And so as a result of this, there's this war that breaks out with the Midianites and Moabites to completely, basically destroy them because of what they've done. And so this is what we find in Numbers chapter 31, verse 19. It says, "And as for you, remain outside the camp 7 days." So this is referring to those people who had been in the war. It says, "And for you, remain outside the camp 7 days. Whoever has killed any person and whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day." So this one's a little bit more serious than touching a dead animal. This is 7 days that they have to wait outside the camp, and they have to clean themselves multiple times. And then verse 20, it says, "Purify every garment, everything made of leather, everything woven of goat's hair, and everything made of wood." Then Eleazar the priest said to the men of the war who had gone to the battle, "This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord commanded Moses. Only the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the tin, the lead, everything that can endure fire you shall put through the fire, and it shall be clean. And it shall be purified with the water of purification. But all that cannot endure fire, you shall put through water." So not only these men, not only the men that came back from this war, everything they brought with them, everything in their possession at that time that they brought back was expected to be purified. He says, anything that you can burn and burn everything off, do it. Now, again, we go back to the wool and things like that, clothing. They couldn't burn it, so they had to clean it in a different way, and everything had to be purified. It was to God's standards, and these were safety precautions. These were safety precautions to protect the society. All the people who weren't in the war, this was to protect them. Everything that had been brought back. In verse 24, it says, "You shall wash your clothes on the 7th day and be clean, and afterward you may come into the camp." So after that period of quarantine that they had to go through, after being outside the camp, after the 7 days and washing multiple times and washing all their things, they could come back in. They could rejoin society at that point. They were considered clean, and they no longer posed a risk to the rest of society. They could rejoin their normal people. They could go back home. Were these soldiers sick? No, they weren't sick. These are probably the healthier people of society, right? Our military is usually pretty healthy. They're usually pretty fit. But when we think about this, why would God say they have to remain outside the camp for a week? Why would he do that? Well, it makes sense when we think about what happens at war, especially this type of war, swords and spears and arrows, close combat. And this wasn't dropping missiles from a computer like we have today. This was 2 feet from somebody and gore and grotesque things going on. There were a lot of blood and other bodily fluids exchanged in these wars, and it was nasty. There's no telling what people picked up by having this situation, by being involved in this. When these fights were carried out, it was just grotesque. There's really no other words for it. Gruesome and grotesque. And so these men went through this. They don't know whether those other people were carrying diseases or not. And so God built in a plan that not only themselves, but all of their weapons, all of their instruments, all of the loot that they brought back had to go through this purification. Everything that was brought home had to be cleaned. It had to be sanitized. God's not willing to risk any of us. He wasn't willing to risk them, and so he always made sure that he put in protection. He put in barriers in place. There's another situation that we have with executions. God instilled that there were times that people should be executed. If you go over to Leviticus chapter 24, verse 11 with me, when someone committed a crime that was worthy of the death penalty, God was very specific with how it had to be done. They did not do this on the town square, right in the middle of camp where everybody else was. Now, I know all the movies that we watch, they always make a big spectacle with the person, and they do it right in front of everybody. That's not what God instructed. That's not how God had Israel do this. In Leviticus chapter 24, verse 11, says, "And the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed. And so they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelemith, the daughter of Debri of the tribe of Dan. Then they put him in custody, that the mind of the Lord might be shown to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Take outside the camp him who is cursed. Then let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. This young man who cursed God received the death penalty for his actions. And it wasn't done right in the middle of town square where there were probably markets where people fellowshipped and congregated and hung out and took walks. God says, take them outside the camp. He says, remove them from the rest of society. This isn't to be done around the general population. He put in measures to protect the population, to protect society, even when he's executing righteous judgment. When God says that, this is the penalty for what you have done, you don't do it in the town. He says you move outside the camp. You don't put society at risk. And so we see these different measures. We see these different lengths that God goes to protect Israel, to protect the people. Even when it's something righteous, he was very careful. He was always careful with Israel. He's careful with us. He expects us to be careful with one another. And we've looked at a lot of unpleasant situations. There are positive ones too. If you look at Leviticus chapter 12, this is a more pleasant one. This is the birth of children, our newborn babies. In Leviticus 12, at the very beginning, chapter 1, we find some purification instructions for mothers and the babies that are going to take place. And you'll notice that there's a length of times that are given to protect these babies and protect the mothers and society. This is Leviticus chapter 12 and verses 1 through 3. It says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a woman has conceived and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As in the days of her customary impurity, she shall be unclean. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. So for this period of time, God says this baby and this mother are at risk. And so he puts in measures. It isn't until the 8th day that the male child can come out and be circumcised. That's when the circumcision can take place. The mother and the baby are basically quarantined, right? They're removed. Now, it doesn't say, I don't know that nobody can go visit them, but I would imagine that most of the time they just kept who was in the household with them there. They didn't take the baby out and go party and go to the store, and they didn't take the baby out to public. God said to stay in and stay safe. Now this baby, he's not sick. The mother's not sick. And what is the purpose of this? It's to build up immunities, right? Build up antibodies. We know that through breastfeeding, babies gain the mother's antibodies. There's a protective layer that comes with time. In reality, what happens when those brand new babies come through these front doors? All the ladies come running, pinching cheeks and kissing foreheads and hands and feet and touching, right? Because it's fun. It's exciting. That's what we love. We love little babies. They're cute. They make cute noises. They're just adorable. There's nothing bad about babies until you get a blowout. And then it's mom's turn. No, I did my fair share. But there's a protection that God says, hey, you need to remove yourself. Everybody else can't control themselves because they're too cute. And so God implements this. He knows they're going to get their little cheeks squeezed and kissed. And so he says, this makes sense. This is what makes sense. And look at verse 4. It says, She shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. She shall not touch any hallowed thing, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled. So not only does he give that week and then the circumcision, but he says, you've got 33 days. You have this period of time. Why? Well, mothers just lost a lot of blood. They continue to lose blood. Their vitamins are depleted. There are things in their body that the babies suck out of them. I've watched it 4 times with my wife. She says she loses a little bit of her brain power every time she has a kid. I don't believe that. She's still intelligent. Hopefully she's watching. No, but it's real. It's true, right? The babies are like a leech. They need the nutrition. They need the nutrients from the mothers. So the mother's body's depleted of things. The babies haven't ever been exposed to society. They haven't been exposed to bacteria or viruses. And so they go through this period of self-quarantine, basically. Not because either one of them are sick, but because they would be at risk. And then the mother technically would put other people at risk. And there are things that happen with the body that would infect other people. And then verse 5, it says, "But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean 2 weeks in her customary impurity, and she shall continue in the blood of her purification 66 days." Now, I have no idea why there's a differentiation between males and females. I have nothing. I can't go to science and give you, after church, don't grab me and sit me down and be like, all right, now let me hear your opinion of why. I have nothing. I have no idea why this would be. This is one of those things that you can take your list at home of questions for God, add that on that one, and then at some point you can ask God. I have no idea what it is. But what I do know is God is perfect in his coordination and in his planning. And you can ask him yourself of why this makes sense. But there's always a reason. God always has a great love for his children. I'm sure there's a perfect explanation for this. But we really just look at the basis. There's a protection for his people. There's a protection for the babies, and there's a protection for the mothers, and there's a protection for society that he wants to ensure. And so these two are quarantined because of the potential contact of blood, potential infections that could take place. And so we see this guiding example that God leads through Israel of we have to be careful. We have to be diligent about what makes sense. What makes sense? Using common sense to make sure that we understand this. And all this is backed up by science more and more now, and understanding that. So that we see that there's a whole lot more to quarantining than just quarantining the sick. If you're ill, you're quarantined. That's not the only example that we find. We've gone through several of those examples where when there's a risk, they were also expected to be quarantined. We are the same way. There's going to be times that we have to avert risk and we have to take precautions just for the safety of everybody else. It's not fun for us. It's not what we want. But it's what God set the standard as. That's the tone that he set. So when we really think about this and we think about coming to church every single week and the expectation on that, our weekly Sabbath, well, what is it that we're coming to a commanded assembly? This is something God says you will attend. How does this play into that? When we think back, right after the feast, we went virtual, right? Why? Because there was a big risk. And even with us going virtual, large groups of the congregation got it. Multiple families got it. We either had it at the feast or we got it after the feast. And we did what we could. We were trying to protect each other. We limited our contact. It mitigated some of the risk probably, but it didn't mitigate all of it. That's just the reality of what we live in. We can do the best that we can. This is still life. COVID is still very real, and it's something we're going to deal with probably forever. This is the new normal flu. And the better grasp that we have on understanding what it is that we're doing, the better we can protect one another. And understanding this pattern that God has established. We have to remember that we're not just skipping a Sabbath. Just because we don't get to come to services here together, it isn't saying that we don't respect the Sabbath. It's not saying we don't understand the commandment that God gives us. It's not a lack of faith. It's understanding this balance that God says we have to have. We have to hold one another to a higher level than ourselves. Yes, I may need to be at Sabbath services, but there's a chance that maybe I would be more of a danger to everybody else than for me to be here. And I have to take that. All these times that we've gone virtual, we were not breaking God's commandment to come together. And we know this because of Scripture. We're going to look at another Scripture here in just a second, where we find that there's a precedence that God sets. There's a precedence that quarantine precedes commanded assemblies. So we've gone through all these examples of quarantine, the sick and people who are non-sick, items that potentially could make people sick. We're also going to go through an example where quarantine supersedes a commanded assembly. And with that said, I want to kind of put in this caveat. When we think about God's holy days, they are commanded. There's no questions, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. We are expected to be at God's holy days. And that doesn't change. That's not just the annual holy days. Today is a holy day. Today is a holy day. Now, I think throughout time, the Sabbath is set apart. It's sanctified. I think through time, we sometimes get lax, and we view the annual Sabbaths on a higher degree than we do the weekly Sabbath, because it becomes our routine. It's become second nature to us. We have to be really careful about that, because today is a holy day. It is set apart by God, and it is expected to be kept at the same degree that the annual holy days are. That's my little soapbox. It's a whole sermon in itself of what today really is and what it means. But there are times, I think, that we kind of let that slip. And we view today subpar from annual holy days when it's not. It's really not. Now to kind of get back on track, I have zero intentions of ever going virtual only again. It's not what I want to do. I already told you the example that happened in Fort Wayne. That may be the reality of what's going on, but I don't want to shut down. We should be here. We should do our best to be here, but at the same time, the world that we live in sometimes doesn't always lead us to that. It's not the best decision. It's not the wisest decision, and God expects us to mitigate the risk as much as we can, and we've seen examples of that. We see examples where God mitigates the risk for the greater good, for all of the people. So we have to take the whole Word of God. We can't just pick and choose snippets. And I think at times we've done that, and we've seen some division that's been caused because people have that question of, are we forsaking the Sabbath? Are we forsaking the assembling of ourselves? We're not. We're not doing that. The children of Israel were expected to keep all the holy days just like we were. They were expected to keep the Sabbath. Otherwise, they were kicked out of the congregation. They were expelled. If they weren't obedient, they were removed, because God didn't want that infecting everybody else. That mindset, that mentality, it wasn't something they could physically catch. Well, in a sense, I guess they could physically catch it. But we stopped going to services every week. We physically catch that. But they understood the importance of attendance, and they kept the Sabbath days because they knew if they didn't, then they couldn't be part of the congregation. They were expelled. So is there some great sin, or is there some great lack of faith that we have if we have to quarantine, if we can't attend in person? The easy answer is no. There was a precedent set by God long ago that established this. It was through Moses that there are quarantining rules. There's a quarantining law that overrules a commanded assembly. When someone was unclean, they could not partake of a special ceremony. And for us, it's one of the most sacred ceremonies that we have. If you go over to Numbers chapter 9 and verse 1. It's Numbers chapter 9 and verse 1. We're given an example here where there's a reschedule, a makeup day. If you miss class, if you miss a test, there's a makeup day, right? Because that test is important. Well, God makes a makeup day for one of his ceremonies because of how important it is. So this is 1 year after they leave Egypt. Okay, so this would be basically the second Passover that Israel is keeping here. This is Numbers chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, 'Let the children of Israel keep the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of the month at twilight, you shall keep it at its appointed time. According to all its rites and ceremonies, you shall keep it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no questions. He says, you shall keep it. Not an option. This is a commanded assembly. This is a commanded ceremony. In verse 4, it says, so Moses told the children of Israel that they should keep the Passover, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. So the children of Israel did. Now there were certain men who were defiled by a human corpse, so that they could not keep the Passover on that day. And they came before Moses and Aaron that day. So here we have this instructions that these men were not to keep this assembly. They were not to keep this commanded assembly, this ceremony. Why? Because they were unclean. They were deemed unclean. They weren't allowed to keep it. And these men are coming and they go, wait a second. I don't understand this. I don't understand. I need an explanation. They go, why can we not keep this? They weren't sick, and they understood the impact of keeping this ceremony. They understood the severity and the penalty for not keeping the ceremony, I guess would be a better way of saying it. They understood that they should be here, and they should be with the assembly, and they should keep this ceremony. And so they're saying, hang on, we're not sick. We're not going to cause any problems to anybody. Why can we not keep this? And this is what we find in verses 7 through 11. It says, and those men said to him, we became defiled by a human corpse. Why are we kept from presenting the offering of the Lord at its appointed time among the children of Israel? So that's their question. Why can't we partake? Why can't we do this? We know we're supposed to. He says, and Moses said to them, stand still that I may hear what the Lord will command concerning you. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, if any of you or your posterity is unclean because of a corpse, or is far away on a journey, he may still keep the Lord's Passover. On the 14th day of the second month, at twilight, they may keep it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So here we find an exception. This is an exception to the Passover. He basically establishes a makeup day, a second Passover. We still are able to do this today if for some reason we missed the first Passover. So because of how important this ceremony is, and it was to them, these men who were defiled, they knew they should partake of it. They should be there and they should do it. They weren't sick, but God says, no, you need to be quarantined. And he even gives an additional, if you're out of town, if you're far away and you can't get here to keep it, he said you can keep this second Passover. And he gives this instructions. We see that the biblical quarantining laws go much farther than just, if you're sick, stay away from everybody. That's not the extent of it. If you're presenting signs, you're not allowed being around everybody else. That's not what he says. We go through these examples and God sets the standard. He says, if there's a risk, if there's a potential risk, take caution. Take caution. Because the devastation that may be caused by one person could impact the entire congregation or the entire camp. That's why we see them removing them to the outside of the camp. We, as individuals, are supposed to quarantine when there is a real risk to others. This is where we find ourselves today. We look at God's instructions. We see what God has done. God is purposeful with everything he does. And he doesn't always explain it. He didn't always explain it to Israel. With time, we have a better understanding of why some of these things have taken place. But in everything God does, he shows a great concern for his children. There's a great concern for each and every one of us. There's a love, there's a respect that he has. And he has that same expectation for how we treat one another and the precautions that we have for one another. We are well aware of the risks that we pose as winter approaches. It's been a risk for 2 years now. This is life. And we're going to carry on the best we can. We're going to continue to have our potlucks. We're going to continue to have our family weekends, gym nights, teen nights, speech clubs. We are going to continue on the best that we can in the environment that we find ourselves in. But I ask that you continue to assess the risk, that you continue to assess the risk that not only you are put into, but the risk that you pose to others. We have to have that same awareness for one another as God did for all of his children, and he still has for us today. We know that wintertime our immune systems are compromised, and we're not quite as healthy or as strong as we are when it's warmer outside. It's just one of the downfalls of being physical. And with that, we can be careful. We can take extra caution. We can be more aware of who we've been around. We just need to be diligent, right? We need to be diligent. God sets the tone. And everything that we do, we try to base it off of God's terms. And we use his example. We can see what he has done. And it's not that you're sick. It's not that you are coughing and hacking and have a fever. That's the only time you quarantine. We see the example that he set, the standards that he puts in place. So as we live our lives, as we continue to deal with this, I ask you to avert risk the best that you can. Avert the risk and show the same amount of love that God extends to each and every one of his children.